Hello. I don't know why I was so weird about that. All right, we're going to talk about ecosystems. Oh, welcome to Eshelman's Excellent Adventure. I have filmed this exact PowerPoint about 5 times, and we're gonna power through. Okay, we're gonna power through. Here we go. All right. First things first. We're going to do like multiple steps to this lesson. Don't freak out. We got time. Relax. So we're going to talk about threats to ecosystems. What are threatening ecosystems? Like what's affecting them? And then you're going to apply that idea, and you're either going to do some research, or you're going to build an ecosystem in a jar, and it's going to be dope. Then we're going to talk about management and how we manage threats versus wildlife, all that fun jazz. And you're going to find a current event about some management strategies, and then we're going to take a quiz. And that quiz is for you. You can use your notes, all that fun, good stuff. But that quiz is meant for you to be able to identify what is important, and we're just going to make sure we're pulling out that important information. Our key questions for this lesson and the next video we'll talk about is what are different threats to ecosystems? How do we manage those threats? And how do we manage ecosystems and wildlife? So we're going to review our key questions from a while ago. I think it was the week before last. We talked about ecosystems and regions, and we defined ecosystem. We discussed ecosystems versus ecoregions, and we identified the 3 that we see here in Colorado. So the 4 components of an ecosystem, it has to be a given area. It can be big, it can be little, but it has to be a given area. There need to be living and non-living factors in that given area, and it has to be able to function together as a whole. So an ecosystem is exemplified down here at the bottom. That is a picture from the San Juan Mountains. There are living things, there are non-living things. Non-living factors include things like topography, so the slope of the land, or temperature, or altitude. All of those things are going to impact the things that live there. And clearly that whole function is working, or that whole system is functioning together because it is alive. And then ecoregions are more of a broad description of that area. And a lot of times in those climates or biomes or whatever you want to call it, we can very typically see very similar ecosystems. So in Colorado, we have desert, mountain, and plains, which are 3 very different and very cool ecosystems. So we're going to talk about the threats. There are 5 threats that we're going to discuss. These are all pictures of them. So we'll talk about natural disaster, overexploitation, pollution, habitat fragmentation, and invasive species today. There's obviously way more than 5 things threatening ecosystems. However, I think these are 5 that we can pretty easily identify, and sometimes they're 5, not all 5 of them, but agriculture can be involved with threatening ecosystems as well. So I tried to pick some that agriculture can be a problem with. And if we don't talk about problems, we can't solve them. So let's look at it. Natural disaster. Well, that's just a disaster. So natural disasters can serve a purpose for the ecosystem. So they're not always all bad. Wildfire is a great example of being able to renew an ecosystem. However, wildfires that get like way out of control and all of that, like in Australia, those fires earlier this year were a huge problem for the ecosystem as well as the populations of humans that live there. But it could serve a purpose because it is a natural disaster. It's a thing that happens, and it can happen for a reason. It can also cause other threats. So a lot of times after large wildfires, mudslides are a potential issue as well. So on and so forth. There's all kinds of natural disasters. Overexploitation. Essentially, overexploitation is that we as human beings overuse a resource to the point where we are affecting an ecosystem. One of our biggest examples in the United States was when you guys, we thought that bison was like the ultimate thing to hunt and kill. We thought it was great. We were all about that. Okay, I don't really know why. I'm sure if I paid attention in history at some point, I'd remember. But anyway, so that top picture is a pile of bison skulls that were collected throughout, I don't know. So you can see there's a grown man standing at the bottom of that pile and a grown man standing at the top of that pile. That's a big pile. We actually almost pushed the bison to extinction, and through a lot of management strategies, we've been able to bring those back. One that's kind of currently going on is the ivory trade. And so things like elephants and rhinos and those animals that are seen as being commodities for their ivory, there are a lot of issues within those ecosystems because they're no longer balanced. And the same was true with bison, and I think you could find resources, and you could probably research and look at how the way that we overexploited bison is still affecting the Great Plains today. A lot of people think that you solve this issue by no longer using that thing, which through poaching practices, we can kind of figure out pretty quickly that that's not super effective. I mean, obviously, to say, well, stop using ivory. Okay, that is effective, but if people are going to continue to poach, there's going to be continued balance issues within ecosystems. Pollution. Pollution often affects the resources made available to wildlife and plants. So this top photo, that's like an irrigation canal that is experiencing an algae bloom because there's been a lot of fertilizer runoff. And so in environmental science, you've probably learned about algae blooms and some of the fertilizer runoff issues that are happening throughout waterways. And so that algae can actually grow really well because it's fertilized, which causes problems for that whole ecosystem. It causes problems for marine ecosystems as well as land-based ecosystems. So that is a very common example of pollution. Other problems could be polluted snow. Eventually that'll melt and work into watersheds and other ecosystems. And I think that's one that we don't always think about. So basically, plants and animals either don't have access to that resource anymore, or that resource has been affected to the point where it is going to cause problems for the entire ecosystem. Most of the time it's us, because we're not really good creatures, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, there are other sources, and it could be a really simple source. It could be this spring water is polluted with cow manure from when they were here grazing. And that issue will work itself out, but in the meantime, it's polluted and causing problems in an ecosystem. So it's not always us, but yeah. Habitat fragmentation. I wonder if I could arrange my head to be the head of this elephant. Oh, I think I totally can. Maybe? No. Wait, what if I go this? This is probably why I've filmed this 7 times. Hang on. I can't really see it. Is that it? I hope that's it. Anyway, sorry. Habitat fragmentation basically means we've taken the natural habitat of that species and it has been broken up somehow, most of the time with things like transportation, roadways, railways, sometimes through agricultural fields. Mining and logging industries can do the same thing. Some of the problems it causes is mostly habitat loss. That seems like it makes sense. Disruption in migratory patterns. So if that species always goes the same way every single spring for spawning, for reproduction, for feeding, for whatever, They migrate for some reason, and there's now a mine in the middle of their migratory pattern that can cause some problems. It could cause resource problems. So, for example, if they can't get to where they usually go, they no longer have that resource, and it could disrupt the overall functionality of the system. Invasive species. An invasive species is an animal that is not native to that ecosystem. Okay, so that ecosystem was developed and evolved and created with all of these biotic and abiotic factors working together. And now all of a sudden there's this non-native species in there. And if it can exist and be happy, then it's actually not that much of a threat. However, if its population gets out of control or it starts causing problems to the ecosystem as a whole, then it is considered invasive. Most of the time, in terms of whether or not we take care of it, we list things as invasive once it takes money to manage. Once there's money tied to it. Once we have to go out of our way to make sure that this thing isn't causing issues within the ecosystem, then it is considered invasive. So prime example is cats. So cats in a lot of ecosystems, especially around here, are going to be non-native species. Now, sometimes, because they reproduce very efficiently, sometimes their populations get out of control and they cause problems in ecosystems. Another example is kudzu, which is the plant here in the middle. It apparently grows up to a foot a day, and I guess those are estimates, but that seems like a lot. Grows up to a foot a day, and it was introduced into the southern U.S. as a grazing alternative for cattle. And in Japan, where it is native to, it dies off in the winter because it gets cold enough in Japan. Well, it doesn't get cold enough in the southern U.S., and so it has just taken over, completely taken over. And then the European starling is also considered an invasive species. So overall, the issues with invasive species are disrupting the functionality of the system. So for some reason, something is not working with something else. When we look at ecosystems and ecology, we're looking at relationships, okay? We're looking at relationships between the living organisms within that system and the non-living organisms and those interactions. And so, and those non or abiotic factors and how they interact with the biotic factors, right? And so, in order for all of those things to interact and function and all of that, there's a system. And when there's an invasive species, that system is disrupted. The other thing that invasive species cause is that they can create an imbalance. So again, if we look at those interactions, maybe there's an invasive species like the cat who is hunting part of the ecosystem too much. Well, that could be an issue. Or if there is a species that does not have a natural predator, then that could be an issue too, and it can get out of balance, or it can cause an imbalance by overhunting and overexploitation. So we're going to apply this. There are two options. You're going to pick one of them. One of these I think is really cool, and I think it's a great review of ecosystems. In fact, if we were still in school, we'd probably give this a try because it seems awesome. So on YouTube, there's a lot of really cool examples. I've found Life in Jars. There is a question mark on the channel. Anyway, you can look him up. It's like, I don't know where he's from, but he goes around and makes he calls them ecospheres. So you're probably going to have to do some research and figure out how to best build it. But basically, you're going to go get a sample of an ecosystem and put it in a jar, and it's going to be awesome. I'm very excited. I think I'm going to do it too, and then I'll do like a little video update for you guys. So you're going to want to do some research, kind of figure out how to best go about it. There's a ton of videos on YouTube, even on Facebook right now. And then on a Google Doc, you'll show me a picture of your jar. I'd love like a before and after of like, so before it settles and it's just murky and gross. And then afterwards, once you start to see stuff, you don't have to have a before and after, but some sort of picture with a summary of like how you built this thing, and what was your process, and then an explanation of how it fits the 4 components that we talked about earlier. Your second option is to, for each threat, you're going to find a case where this thing really happened and what happened to an ecosystem. So a great example for natural disaster would be the fires that were in Australia earlier this year, and how those have impacted ecosystems. Okay, so you're going to provide a link and a short summary of each example. You're going to do all 5. Your summary doesn't have to be very long. It does have to be your own work. So do not copy and paste your summary. That is very frustrating, and you're not going to get credit for it because it's not your work. So make sure it's your work, and give me a little summary. What happened and why is it affecting the ecosystem? If you can answer those 2 questions, you're done with your summary. Okay. As always, if you have questions, let me know. I'm going to set this due date for Sunday at midnight, but you turn it in whenever you're done with it, okay? That's what I got. Check in, ask questions, whatever you need. I'm here to help you out. Thank you for listening to me talk about ecosystems forever. Next, we're going to talk about wildlife management and managing threats and things like that. I will talk to you guys later.